I'm David Holloway, retired professor of history and political science, former co-director of CSEC. And it's my great pleasure to welcome back to CSEC Magda Stawkowski, who spent 2 years here as a MacArthur Fellow and a Stanton Fellow. And she is today going to talk about her book. She's a medical anthropologist and therefore a rather rare bird at CSEC. But nevertheless, I shouldn't say nevertheless, but we are very grateful for the work that she has been doing on the people in Kazakhstan affected by the numerous tests the Soviet Union conducted there. So Magda will talk about her book, Atomic Collective, which was published, I think, in June of last year. And right, Magda.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Is that working okay? Well, thank you so much for being here. And I am so really thrilled to be back. It's been a while, I think, since I was last here. So it's wonderful to see people I've known for a while now, but also see some new faces. So thank you for inviting me. And I'm going to talk today to you about my book. So, oops. The winter before I arrived to Koian for field work, the pastures around the village had frozen solid. For months, temperatures held steady at -40, and Fahrenheit and Celsius converge at that point, as if the measurement systems give up reaching for the extreme. Sprigs of steppe grasses poke through, but animals couldn't punch through the thick sheet of ice to graze. Cows don't dig with their hooves, I was told. They use their heads. And heads weren't enough. For months, everyone in the village tried with shovels and with some success to clear some ground, but that wasn't enough. By winter's end, nearly 100 animals had died, almost the entire herds belonging to 2 families. The ice-covered fields, a macabre resting place. When spring came and the temperatures rose, the village began to smell with an intensity that's hard to imagine. Bloated corpses, black with flies. The stench was horrible, Altanai told me. For weeks, everything, our clothes, houses, air, reeked of rotting flesh. Before the carcasses could sink into knee-deep mud, which follows the ice, the residents hauled them over a hill to a garbage pile and set them ablaze. By February, the village had almost no food left, and by spring, everyone's clothing hung loose on their bodies. Coal supplies had dwindled and homes were cold. Frequent blizzards made the 15-mile walk to the closest town impossible. Koian, indeed, was cut off for 4 months. This is the village where I conducted field work for over a decade. A village on the edge of the Semipalatinsk Polygon, the Soviet nuclear test site, where 456 nuclear devices were detonated between 1949 and 1989. A landscape still contaminated with plutonium, cesium, strontium, americium, and most recently, tritium. These are not abstract risks. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,000 years. It will outlast civilization. Tritium continues to migrate through the groundwater, with concentrations near test boreholes reaching levels thousands of times above safe drinking limits. It cycles through the soil into the grasses, into the livestock, into the milk and meat that Koianers consume. In fact, recent studies have found measurable tritium in cow's milk from villages in the region. The Shagan River that you see here in this video, which flows from the atomic lake through grazing lands, exceeds intervention limits for tritium at multiple points. Groundwater, for example, contains tritium at 95,000 becquerels per liter. That is 1,000 times the EU safe drinking water limit and 130 times that in the United States. The contamination, in other words, is not historical, it's ongoing. And here is what surprised me the most about that nightmare winter. It didn't make anyone finally leave. It didn't break them. The local mayor, the Hakim, had been begging villagers for years to relocate to the nearby town of Oktyabr, citing power outages, almost no road maintenance, the lack of health care and schools. He offered them housing, access to animal pastures, but they refused. They preferred to live, and I learned, sami po себе, on their own and keeping to themselves. Rather than move somewhere, they'd have to pay for houses and pastures. Quote, that would only further line the pockets of lazy and money-hungry local administrators who could care less about us, end quote. Why? Why, in the face of starvation, isolation, radiation contamination, and death, do people choose to stay? This is the central question of my book. The question of why people live on contaminated land haunts nuclear anthropology as well as other scholarly fields. From Hiroshima to Chernobyl to Fukushima, from Marshall Islands to Hanford and Washington State, scholars have documented communities affected by radioactive contamination. In most cases, the dominant narrative follows a very similar arc. Contamination produces victims. Victims make claims. And affected communities, after all that, seek recognition, compensation, or relocation from the state. Adriana Petrina's foundational work on Chernobyl gave us the concept of biological citizenship, the idea that in post-Soviet Ukraine, radiation exposure became a resource through which people could access social protections. People learned to document their suffering, to navigate bureaucracies, translate their damaged bodies into claims on the state. In the Marshall Islands, Barbara Rose Johnston discusses communities that have organized for decades around demands for compensation from the US. The framing centers almost always on injustice, debt owed, recognition demanded. But in Koian, I encountered something completely different. People do not claim victim status. They did not organize for compensation, though a compensation program does indeed exist and they technically qualify. They did not seek to leave. There has been not a single court appeal from citizens living in potentially dangerous areas requesting resettlement. Instead, they stayed and they built something. They call it living sami po себе. And the phrase, in many respects, captures a wealth of meanings, that they are forced to fend for themselves, abandoned by the state, but also that they struggle through days and seasons to maintain their rural home and livelihoods on their own terms, free from economic pressures of urban life in Kazakhstan. It speaks to both their abandonment and their autonomy. What I argue in my book is that Koianers have reinvented a cooperative enterprise for themselves, what I call their atomic collective, where everyday life is not dictated by maximizing profits, but by the collective survival through mutual assistance. Their precariousness implies living socially, depending on networks of support. It's a survival strategy that in many respects, it's antithetical to market-driven life. And to understand this, we need historical context. Here is something that surprised me. Many residents of Koian remember the Soviet period, including the area of active nuclear testing, with something approaching fondness. This is not false consciousness. It reflects a material reality. Because during the Soviet era, Koian was part of a sovkhoz, a state farm, that provided employment, infrastructure, and social services. There was a school, a medical clinic, regular supply deliveries. In fact, there was a road. People had jobs tending collective herds. The state, for all its violence and secrecy about nuclear program, provided a form of security. The nuclear tests themselves were normalized into daily life. Residents remember being told to go outside during tests to watch the mushroom clouds. Children were given a day off of school. The ground would shake, dishes would rattle, and then life would continue as if nothing happened. This doesn't mean people didn't suffer, because indeed they did. Cancer rates were, and in fact remain, elevated in the region. But the suffering existed within a structure that also provided. The calculation wasn't contamination versus no contamination. It was contamination with employment, with community, with state support, versus contamination without any of these things. Everything changed in 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed through national independence movements across Central Asia. The Semipalatinsk Test Site was closed in gesture of social, political, and cultural defiance against the past. The structures that had sustained life at Koian, however, collapsed with them. Western advisors drove the terms of shock therapy, the rapid conversion to free market economics that saw state enterprises liquidated and social protections dismantled. Wealth concentrated into a group of new elites, while people like those in Koian were dispossessed of property, work, and social status quite quickly. The sovkhoz, in fact, went bankrupt almost overnight. Equipment was sold off. Herds were distributed chaotically and then largely disappeared. The school closed. The medical clinic lost its staff and supplies. The road connecting Koian to the outside world stopped being maintained. Within a few years, the population dropped from around 300 to about 100 or so. Those who could leave, who had education, connections, and youth, did. As Tursenbek, one of the village elders, once told me, all my savings turned to zero, and we got zero support from the state. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. When the Polygon was officially closed and the army disbanded, the test site became a landscape littered with millions of tons of scrap metal. No longer an active and policed military zone, Koianers scavenged for whatever they could find: pipes, bricks, windows, metal of any kind, anything from the infrastructure left over from the Soviet nuclear program. And critically, there was open land, vast pastures where animals could graze without rent or fees. The state's absence, paradoxically, created a kind of freedom. By the mid-1990s, large-scale livestock farming in Kazakhstan had virtually disappeared, and animals were increasingly concentrated in small households for individual consumption. Cash was hard to come by, but if you had land and animals, you had something. As Tursenbek put it, at least we had milk and eventually meat when the herds got bigger. In a sense, Koianers became entrepreneurs of abandonment, seizing opportunities the state withdrawal created. They weren't passive victims of post-Soviet collapse, but active agents who recognized that open land and scrap metal could be converted into capital, that growing herds could generate income, that the state's absence was also an opening. This is a peculiar form of entrepreneurship, one born not out of market incentives, but out of survival necessity. What emerged in Koian after the Soviet collapse was something I came to think, as I mentioned, the Atomic Collective, a reinvented cooperative enterprise built on the ruins of the sovkhoz. Here, family resources are pulled together into a system where networking, gift-giving, and kinship ties provide stability amidst limited resources. Everyone is expected to contribute to Koian's overall well-being, and all help is returned in kind. In emergencies, like the winter livestock die-off or seasonal steppe fires that march across the horizon like red ribbons in the pitch-black night, everyone comes together to work and share resources. The same goes for finding runaway livestock in what, to any outsider, is a vast, open, featureless steppe. Koianers follow practices from Soviet times that their parents and grandparents knew. Through movements, habits, and stories of elders, younger villagers have acquired deep knowledge of the land, where to find best grasses, how to rotate grazing to avoid over-harvesting, where to let it grow tall. Ramazan owns the only tractor that the whole village uses and maintains it, a powdered blue Soviet artifact always parked on a slope to jumpstart it. For 5 to 8 weeks every fall, they cut, stack, load, transport, and pile hay until there's enough to last through the long winter. Backs bent under the weight of dried straw, throwing it high onto wagon after wagon, then chucking it onto flat barn rooftops well into the night. With very little cash circulating among them, barter has mostly replaced the economy and any kind of monetary exchange. So, for example, several liters of diesel can get you a ride to Oktyabr, or you can swap a sheep or two and get a couch or rugs or kitchen cabinets or a television set or socks and clothing. Koianers frequently refer to their livestock as a living and breathing communal bank. To understand why people stay in Koian, one has to seriously consider the alternatives. Those who moved from Koian to the coal town of Karaganda found cramped apartments in five-story Soviet-era Khrushchevki in the sprawling urban slum on the periphery. They were chronically unemployed or working as custodians or taxi drivers if they could even get a car. In 2020, a one-room apartment in Karaganda, for example, cost 30,000 tenge per month, or about $200 per month or so, utilities being extra. And most individuals who moved couldn't find jobs that paid enough for that kind of independence. Those with families still relied on the village and kid networks for financial support. And there were psychological effects as well. As Altanai put it, I hate being in the city. I'm bored. There's nothing to do. On top of that, I'm alone with my thoughts. Who wants to be alone with their thoughts? In the village, you are never alone. There's always work to do. There's always someone to do it with. And here I should address what might seem like the obvious question. What about radiation contamination? Koianers are not ignorant of the risk. They know people have died young from cancers. They have been told by scientists that their bodies carry elevated levels of radioisotopes. But contamination is not experienced as an abstract risk to be weighed against other factors. It is simply part of the landscape they inhabit, no more avoidable than, let's say, the brutal winters or the isolation. And critically, when they consider moving to the city, they don't see it as an escape from contamination. Karaganda's air is quite thick with coal dust and other industrial pollutants. The apartments are cramped and poorly ventilated. They occasionally actually explode. Gas explosions are actually quite common. As several Koianers put it to me, at least here we have clean air and open steppe. The contamination calculus, again, is not village versus city purity. It's one form of environmental harm versus another. And in Koian, at least, they have everything else that makes their life worth living. Let me tell you a story about Aygul. So she was born in Koian, but raised in the city. She became a teacher of Kazakh language. She loved urban life and visited the village, but never imagined herself returning there permanently. She saw herself as a cosmopolitan woman. But then, at 23, she was abducted for marriage. Her father-in-law and his brother arranged for her to be taken, thrown into a car, and brought to her future husband's family home in Koian. She resisted for 2 days, but everyone pressured her. Friends, his parents, her parents. The wedding was 2 weeks later. This practice, by the way, of bride abduction has increased since Kazakhstan's independence in 1991. It's part of the broader re-traditionalization that accompanied the post-Soviet search for national identity. It's a complex tradition, and scholars like Cynthia Werner have documented its variations from consensual elopements to coerced abductions like Aygul's. She became a Kalim, a daughter-in-law, occupying the lowest position in the household, akin to an enslaved person. She had to do everything: clean, cook, serve tea, be quiet and respectful. And for the first 5 years, there was no electricity in Koian whatsoever. She woke up at 6 every morning to start a fire with dry cow dung and milk 30 cows by hand. She churned butter manually, baked bread, heated the stove again and again. It was hellish life, she told me, but we got used to it. I want to be careful here not to minimize what happened to Aygul. She was indeed taken against her will. Her initial resistance was overridden by family pressure on both sides. Her own parents, it turned out, had quietly approved of the match and saw it as a good opportunity for their daughter. The first years were difficult: back-breaking labor, the loss of her teaching career, the distance from her parents and siblings in the city. When I asked her if she ever wanted to leave, she was honest. In the beginning, yes. I cried. I missed my mother. But over time, something shifted. Her father-in-law, she said, treated her like a daughter. She bore children. She built relationships in the village. The question of whether her eventual contentment justifies her abduction is not mine to answer. And I don't think Aygul would frame it as that either. What I can say is that her trajectory complicates easy narratives about rural women as simply oppressed or simply liberated. Her city relatives fight her constantly to leave. They see only wildness, she says, the stove, the sweeping landscapes, the isolation, the radiation. They speak of gas stoves, vacuum cleaner, and stoves. They speak of civilization, as she says. But Aygul sees something else. She sees their urban anxieties, the debt, the job insecurity, the cramped apartment as their own form of hardship. Tursenbek and others insist that despite everything, theirs is a good life, and no one in Koian lives in poverty. This might, for many of us, seem like denial. And it did to me, actually, initially. But I came to see things also from their perspective. What they have, land, animals, community, meaningful work, freedom from bosses and landlords, and the market economy, these are indeed real goods. Goods that the city does not offer. And as Tursenbek said to me, we are self-sufficient and don't live in poverty. We live sami-posibia and live simply and quietly. Our food supply grazes on pastures. It's our bank. If staying in Koian offers freedom, leaving exposes Koianers to a different reality, which is discrimination. And in 2011, as a gesture of thanks to families who hosted me, I took several villagers on a vacation to a mountain spa resort, a typical Soviet sanatoria, built during the Soviet era for local coal miners from Karaganda and their families that was now privatized in catering to middle-class Kazakhs, but also ethnic Russians that were coming from cities like Karaganda or Pavlodar or the capital city, Astana. The excitement before the trip was truly palpable. The women colored each other's hair. We discussed cocktail dresses. The men shaved carefully, packed their nicest slacks. We sang pop songs the whole way when we were going to the sanatoria with all the dust coming in through the vents. But it was a happy, happy time. But from the moment we arrived, the Koianers were marked. The staff watched us like hawks as we checked in. They told us to come down, to lower our voices, to walk rather than run. Their more cosmopolitan countrymen whispered about their cheap jeans and brightly colored polyester shirts. At the banquet hall, guests openly mocked us and the difficulty some Koianers had eating with forks, which they typically don't use. In fact, in Koian, meals are communal. Everyone eats from a shared plate with spoons or their hands, or passing food around the table. Forks are really for city folk. Members of our group were repeatedly approached, asked where they were from, and told bluntly, we know who you are, and we don't want any svoloch or scum here. People from the Polygon bear what I call a geographic stigma. They are perceived as polluted, biologically degenerate, spiritually degenerate, and ill. The wider region of tiny, isolated villages itself carries this meaning. Those coming from there are seen as backward, uneducated, contaminated in body and mind, both by poverty and nuclear testing. What surprised me, though, was not the prejudice expressed, but rather how Koianers responded. They didn't complain about being shunned. They didn't modify their behavior at all. In fact, they doubled down. The men ignored staff warnings and partied as loudly as humanly possible. They jumped rambunctiously into the pool, danced their nights away all the way till 6 o'clock in the morning. They spoke Kazakh as loudly as they could, making fun of other patrons who, most of the time did not understand Kazakh language. No one complained about being treated badly. Everyone had tremendous amounts of fun. And after we returned, Tursenbek reflected, everyone who doesn't live in Koian, including the people from Oktyabr, who themselves once lived in Koian and are our relatives, think we are stupid. Most people don't know where we are on the map, but we stay because it's our duty. It's where our ancestors are buried, and we are mostly free to do what we want. In the village, they are free. Outside it, they encounter a world that marks them as less than, as other, as contaminated. given that widespread understanding of them confining themselves to Koian is not a retreat, it's liberation. And the discrimination of Koianers extends into their encounters with scientific and medical institutions. And here there is a longer story. And in 1997, an international team of scientists that was sponsored by the European Union money conducted major research study in Koian. And the project specifically sought to examine the relationship between radiation exposure and cancer incidence in the region. From a scientific perspective, Koian was absolutely ideal. Here we have 3 generations of people living on contaminated land, people who are born before testing, experience testing, and are, first, second, third generation after testing. They were never studied before by Western scientists. The literatures and some scientists whom I have spoken to began to think of Koian as ideal research subjects. They were willing, they were docile, or at least they assumed as much. A local physician helped recruit participants. With her authority backing the project, all 48 families at the time agreed to participate. And for 3 summers, scientists collected biospecimens, blood, stool samples, urine, sperm, from nearly every resident. The findings were stark. Residents showed actually a 7-fold increase in discentric chromosomes, a reliable indicator of radiation damage. Discentric chromosomes are cells with 2 centromeres instead of 1, an abnormality caused by radiation breaking and rejoining DNA strands. Their presence in blood samples is essentially a biological record of radiation exposure, not just past exposure, but in fact, current exposure. And it's a tool used since Hiroshima as a dosimetry tool. And men and children showed particularly high concentrations of radioisotopes in their bodies. And this, in many effects, reflects a gender division of labor, right? Men and children spend far more time outside. Men, concerning themselves with livestock breeding, and children simply playing outside, where everybody's encountering contaminated soil, water resources, and vegetation. And women, who do most of their work inside, have less direct exposure to the most contaminated areas. The study was deemed a success that yielded many publications in European epidemiology and radiation biology journals that helped to advance careers of Kazakhstanis and provided dissertation data for graduate students who never returned to Koian after. But here's what didn't happen. No one told the residents what the study found. When I asked one epidemiologist why, his answer was quite revealing. Quote, "If you tell them the truth about what we found, they wouldn't understand anyway. They are not educated. We protected them because there is no cure for what ails them. They are happy as is. Why should we scare them?" This approach closely mirrored Soviet-era practices. From 1956 or so until possibly as late as 1989, Soviet physicians had traveled through the Polygon villages conducting secret radiation studies. They collected specimens as well, recorded illnesses and deaths, all without informed consent, all without sharing results. The only difference, Koianers joke, is that the Soviet scientists at least offered them vodka, which is not what the Europeans wanted to do. As Ramazan, one of the village elders, told me, "We've been experimental rabbits for half a century. We can't say no, or who knows what will happen." But Koianers are not passive. They're not simply accepting of what is happening to them. Through false compliance, they maintain their dignity. Many men simply left for the fields when scientists came to collect sperm samples. Women told me they lied on questionnaires, claiming they never smoked or drank, when they did both quite regularly. Men avoided revealing their medical histories. As Ramazan put it, not everyone gave them sperm. People refused. And we also didn't tell them everything. We just watched and laughed when they went to the outhouses to collect our feces. The distrust extends to the broader medical system, and with reason. In Koian, it is widely believed that hospitals cannot be trusted. Reports of misdiagnoses and unnecessary treatment have fueled the local rhetoric that hospitals are places to get killed. The nearest hospital is 150 miles away, understaffed, unable to treat any kind of complex conditions, including things like heart disease or diabetes. When Koianers do seek care, they encounter discrimination, as they did when trying to vacation. As Aigu told me, they just want us to pee in a cup and tell us we have protein in our urine, and then nothing is done because we are from the Polygon, so it's to be expected. One hospital deputy director I interviewed explained Koianers' reluctance to seek care as a matter of their quote-unquote mentality, as if rural people simply lack critical insights. He offered this medical advice for radiation exposure. Quote, they can prevent serious illness completely by drinking 50 or 100 grams of vodka. Tursenbeck saw right through this immediately. What about the children, he said? Are they supposed to become alcoholics? What about women who are pregnant? In response to this dysfunction, Koianers have developed their own practices. They use traditional healers, not as a rejection of biomedicine, but alongside it, as medical anthropologists have long documented in contexts worldwide. In fact, when formal healthcare is inaccessible, expensive, or hostile, people make their own remedies. Koianers will travel 150 miles to a hospital for serious injury, but for everyday ailments, chronic conditions, or spiritual distress, they turn to local mullahs or bone setters or herbalists. This is medical pluralism born out of necessity. So why do people stay in Koian? Not because they are ignorant of risks. They know. They have had friends and families, members die of cancers at young ages. They've been studied, poked, and measured. They understand contamination is real, not because they are trapped by poverty. The herds they've built could oftentimes purchase an apartment in a city, not because of nostalgia for Soviet era. Their assessment of what they lost when the Soviet Union collapsed, the jobs, the infrastructure, the social safety net, is clear-eyed and indeed pragmatic. They stayed because staying offers something the alternatives do not. It offers them freedom from market economy that has no room for them and privileges proper salaried employment they cannot access. There's distinct sense about them that the city life is simply overrated. Karaganda and other cities are indeed polluted. The apartments are indeed cramped. Wage labor is deeply disciplined. It offers community, a collective existence where work has meaning, where labor is shared, where no one faces hardships alone. It offers autonomy from a state that abandoned them, first in the Soviet era, when they were exposed to radiation without consent or protection, then again after Kazakhstani independence, when the Sovkhoz collapsed, and no support followed, and continually ever since, as promises of compensation and healthcare have gone unfulfilled. It offers connection to ancestral land, to the place where their parents, grandparents are buried, to a landscape they know intimately. And it offers dignity and respect. In the village, they are not marked as backward, contaminated, or other. They are simply themselves. As Tursenbeck said, outsiders don't care about us, but at least we are mostly free to do what we want. Semipalatinsk is their term for this. It captures both the abandonment and the autonomy. It is a form of what Michael Danning has called wageless life, a collective existence as subsistent livestock breeders at the margins of the marketplace, where they have cooperative control over the means to survive and thrive beyond wage labor. This is not a story of victims. It is a story of people who have made a virtue of their circumstances, who have built a life worth living in a place the world would prefer to forget. So what does this tell us about nuclear communities more broadly? First, it complicates dominant frameworks. Biological citizenship, compensation seeking, victim narratives, these are all important and indeed real, but they are not universal. In Koian, we see a different response, not claiming victimhood, but building autonomy, not demanding recognition, but creating a community, not seeking to leave, but making staying meaningful. Second, it forces us to take seriously what affected communities want, not what we imagine they want. Koianers do not want recognition from the state. They do not want scientists studying them. They do not want pity. They want to be left alone, Semipalatinsk, to live their own lives on their own terms. And third, it challenges us to rethink what counts as a good life. By every external measure, life in Koian is certainly hard. contaminated, isolated, precarious. But Koianers insist they are not poor, that they have everything they need, that life in the village is preferable to the alternatives. We might dismiss this as denial, or we might take it seriously as a critique of the forms of life that capitalism and modernity offer as the only options. The realities of Koian resist simple synthesis. This is not a pastoral reverie, and it is not a hopeless resignation. It is something more complex, a community that has found a way to live meaningfully, collectively, on their own terms, in the ruins of empire, on the edges of a nuclear wasteland, in a place the state abandoned and the world forgot. I'd like to end by reading a short passage from my book. Quote, and this is from Tursenbeck. Quote, times were better during the Soviet Union. But what does one compare this to? After the fall, it was worse. It is getting better now, as they say. Now everyone just wants to buy our animals and metal for cheap and make a profit by selling it for a much higher price. They take our diesel and never bring it back or pay us. They make us work for nothing at these awful mines using old machinery like in the days of Gulag labor camps. On top of that, if we are not happy about work in the mines, they tell us just to quit, that they have no problem firing us and finding someone else who would be very happy to have a job. But we really don't care. We are self-sufficient and don't live in poverty. We live semi-posibia and live simply and quietly. We are self-sufficient because our food supply grazes on pastures. It's our bank. Outsiders don't care about us, but at least the administrators allow us to have this land in and around the Polygon, so we have access to good land for pasture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magda. We now open up to questions, and as is our normal practice, our fellows will be the first to ask the questions. Yeah.
Hi, a postdoc fellow here. Thank you so much for a really wonderful presentation. I thought it was a really compelling story. My question is more about teasing out sort of whether you noticed any variation within the community on these sorts of things, because as it stands now, it sounds like a very united front on these questions, but I'm wondering if there is at least any indications of variation based on maybe the generation or the gender, which I think you mentioned could be one of those as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And indeed, are you asking if there's variation in the perception of?
Yeah, if everyone is very solidly, on behalf of staying and.
Yeah, I think, if you're in the villages on the Polygon, on the test site itself and outside of it and in around it, yes, people are actually quite committed to kind of living their own independent existence for sure. And I didn't, mention this in this particular talk, but on the test site itself, I counted 2 summers ago, 62 inhabited places. And those are all winter pastures and little villages, where people, are not particularly concerned with radiation or, not in the way that we would expect.
Thank you.
Kevin Bustamante, CSAC fellow here. Again, thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. I'm curious. I know this is a study in a particular time, in a particular context, with a particular set of people. But, one of your remarks was that, was that the half-life of, I think it was plutonium, you said, has a half-life of 24,000 years, which you said is going to be like after civilization. And, right now, we're not seeing any progress on questions of nuclear disarmament. And so I would like to disagree with you on this point on like whether civilization will last that long, but, things don't look good right now. But what I am curious about is, how do you think about the resiliency of human life after nuclear war? Like, what does this tell us about the possibility of, because that's exactly the point, right? Like, yeah. So what does it look like, I guess, after, and what does this sort of tell us about how people will adapt to whatever landscape exists?
Yeah, I mean, that is the question, right? That's an interesting question, that in some way, I think Koianers and people like them show us what life would look like potentially after nuclear Armageddon. That's assuming we don't destroy the planet completely, right? But that's the thing. Oftentimes when we talk about the Cold War, we think of the Cold War as being cold, as kind of somewhere out there as a tension or maybe proxy wars. But, you know, there were 456 tests. And by the way, just to clarify this point, that's 456 tests with 738 nuclear devices. Because let's say some of the tests had 4 or 5 devices, but they were salvo tests. So there was very short second between, you know, each explosion. So this place was bombed. People were seeing mushroom clouds. The wind was blowing radiation all over. You know, there was fallout. People were experiencing nuclear war regularly. I think when I looked at a map, actually some of the tests, I believe in 1956, in October alone, there were 8 tests. And October was a time of harvest. They were still collecting and harvesting some of the wheat. So in many ways, yes, I think my book is a commentary of this is one possible alternative of what life may look like after nuclear Armageddon. I don't know if that's comforting or not, but it is something to consider for sure. I hope this answers your question.
Hello, my name is Sitara Noor, and I'm a postdoc fellow at CSAC. My question is about, I mean, it's a very fascinating account of resilience and endurance of this community, although I do not really like associating these words, because I think in a number of ways it is another way of saying that there is lack of justice and equality when communities are enduring something and showing resilience in a way. Having said that, I would ask you to, because when we talk about radiation, that's a silent killer, because cancer, it manifests itself in form of cancer, but that is also probably not as visible as would probably be genetical deformities that also show up in the upcoming generations. So was there any, I mean, do you have any statistics on the genetical deformities, abnormalities in the children coming next? And did that endurance and resilience continue till date, seeing some visible forms of radiation impact? Is that resilience intact the same way to the next generation?
Excellent question. Thank you for asking the question. So, you know, the science, radiation science, cause and effect when it comes to cancers or heart disease is quite complicated. In fact, it is very hard to say radiation exposure causes cancer unless it's at very high levels. So, for example, we do know, for example, that people living in and around the Polygon, chances of getting cancer are 2 times higher than the rest of the country. At least that's what the data points to. Now, is the cancer a result of radiation exposure, or is it lifestyle habits? Very hard to actually pinpoint this. One thing you can definitely pinpoint to radiation exposure is cataracts. And in fact, you can tell if the cataracts is a result of too much radioactivity versus cataracts that isn't, that's just kind of developed over time. And we do have increases in that. As far as genetic mutations, funny you ask, because I was there 2 years ago, and this was one of the things I was wondering about was the genetic anomalies birth records. Kazakhstan doesn't have that. There is no database for, are there increases in, you know, some sort of genetic anomalies or phenotypical anomalies in the children being born. What we are finding, there are cases of people who are born without arms or without legs, enlarged brains. There are many cases of that, for sure. Is that, can we clearly connect it to radiation exposure? It's unclear. In fact, one of the things, I'm actually having an article that's going to come out about this. Because the test site is separated as its own administrative unit still, and because Kazakhstan's medical health department, works separately from that, no one is actually tracking current radiation exposure at all on people. They're tracking it all over the site. They're tracking it in rivers and in grasses and in animals. But because there is no government body in charge of looking at health on the test site, no one's tracking this. So there's thousands. You saw the herds that I showed on the video. Since about 3 years ago, there has been a boon, if you will, of using the Polygon as pasture land. Some people have as many as 6,000, 7,000 horses, for example. There are hundreds upon hundreds of sheep. And all of those animals are being grazed there. And then they're sold in city markets. No one's checking for radiation. So we actually don't have a lot of data. We do know there is radioactivity in the region. I actually this is an old slide I've used before. But this is, for example, surface contamination of cesium in one of the areas near which I worked around the nuclear crater. That's what we know. We don't really know what is happening, right? And then you have something like this, for example. Just show you this. So you have craters like this, which are nice watering holes for animals, because as you see, there's not a lot of water on the test site. So you have little rivers like Shagan River, and then you have these craters that are super convenient watering holes for animals. In most recent years, people started digging up the craters and getting all the rest of the metal out of that. And we know that's super dangerous. People can get too much obluchenia, how would you say that, radiation exposure. So I can't answer your question because we literally don't have data. We do know that if you look at the area, cancers are much higher than the rest of Kazakhstan. Heart disease is higher than the rest of Kazakhstan. And specific kinds of cancers like breast cancer, esophagus cancer, colorectal cancer, those are all the cancers that are coming up.
Next.
Hi, I'm Emily Tallow, also a postdoctoral fellow. I wanted to ask you about your personal, like what kind of precautions did you personally take when you were conducting this research? I think we'd all be interested in hearing, particularly because if you resisted or avoided doing certain things where you perceived in a different way, things like that. And then my other question was about, sort of related to Sitara's question about when you have these visible indications, like people dying, literally, or like genetic mutations, is it that they are denying that it's caught because of the radioactivity, or is it that they're like, yeah, there's radioactivity, we accept it? It sounds like from your talk, they're more in the second camp, but I just wanted to hear that sort of more fleshed out.
Just to answer that question, and I have a chapter in the book about it, people believe that they're adapted to radiation, that they're radioactive mutants. They in fact believe that they need radiation to survive.
Wow.
That people oftentimes say, "Чистый воздух нам смерть," meaning clean air is our death. So, people, there is a belief that they actually need a little bit of it.
So do they avoid, sorry to follow up, but so do they avoid doing certain things like digging up craters, or do some
No.
people? They're like, okay.
They do not. Actually, the opening photo, and I'm just going to put this back on. So the cover of my book, this is a photograph I took. This is actually where my book begins. This is the story that it begins. I was driving through the test site for the first time, where this is my driver from Karaganda. He believes radiation is harmful, by the way. And we're driving and we dressed up in 5X suits, totally, like from dust, with Geiger counter on my dashboard. And we're like, it's hot. It's 90 degrees. There's no AC. I'm sweating. He's sweating. And then we come upon this crater, which is near ground zero. And you can see there's a staircase there. I think you can, I don't know if this works, but yeah. There's a staircase. This is actually a diving platform. So lots of people hang out there, and it's hot. And guess what he does? He takes off his suit and jumps in. And I'm like, oh my God, I cannot believe you're doing this. And no, the area wasn't like the water wouldn't be radioactive because even if, right, I mean, all the particles will be on the bottom. It doesn't really matter. We are literally on ground zero in a crater, and he jumps in and swims. And now a lot of the scientists in Kurchatov will also do this. They will also jump in and swim because they don't think the doses are high enough, right? Koianers will swim because they think they're adapted, so it doesn't really matter. So people are doing the same things with different beliefs, but the actions are the same. So a lot of the scientists, they're like, yeah, it's not high enough. We're not getting exposed. So everybody's swimming and driving. There's lots of mines operating in the region, coal, gold, manganese, copper, salt. I think there's a salt mine that just opened, sulfur. The Degelen, one of the areas there as well, very contaminated area. There's a mine there as well. So there's that. But as far as safety is concerned, well, I'm still alive. I may be glowing, but just to be serious about this, for me to prepare for this research, there was a huge learning curve. I mean, I had an epidemiologist, I had a physicist, I had an anthropologist, I had all sorts of people helping me figure things out. And one of the things that I early didn't do was I did bring my own water. So when I was in my little apartment house, I had my own water and so on and so forth. I avoided certain things, like I didn't eat soup. Why? Because people are eating the bone marrow or cooking the meat, and this is where you have a lot of strontium. If there was strontium, we don't know. So just kind of like precautions in that respect. According to my physicist friends and others, they say I wasn't long enough to harm myself, but like no one really knows. So my thing was I literally did not go onto the test site until the last few months, where out of curiosity I said, okay, here I am, an anthropologist living in a little village, traveling all over the villages, but I have never literally been to ground zero. I have, and I need to get to the other side anyways, and it's much shorter. So that's when I actually did do it. So I try to, minimize exposure as much as possible. Mm-hmm. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, I'll take question at the back there. Yes. Well.
Hi, tremendous presentation, Magda. Great to see it again. Do they even have legal recourse? I mean, can they realistically expect compensation via the Kazakh judicial system?
Yes and no. The reality is that there is a program in place for people to get some compensation, extra some days in a spa or a little bit of addition to their salaries, but it's so pathetically small that even to go and seek it out, it's too much. Like it takes 8 hours in a car on a dry, perfect day to get from Karaganda to the village where I worked. Who is going to go to Karaganda where you have no car, no transportation to deal with all the bureaucracy? So there's compensation. It's hard to get. Most people don't really care for it too much. And the Russians say they're not the Soviet Union, so they're not responsible. Mm-hmm. So that's the reality.
I'm going to start from, yes.
Thank you so much. I'm Elizabeth Good. I'm a fellow at CSEC as well. Yeah. This was a true pleasure to listen to. Thank you so much for this presentation. My question is, to what extent is this a story about state abandonment, a strive for identity and autonomy, versus a uniquely nuclear phenomenon, and whether or not you can parse that, or how you're thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. One of the interesting things that I always thought about, and people have told me, is like the further you go away from the test site, the more paranoia and radiophobia you develop. And in some respect, that's true. I mean, the people who are super passionate about, we got to close the site, we got to get rid of the people, move them out, save them, are people that are coming from the cities who have zero understanding of what is happening in the region. I think this is very unique to Kazakhstan, but we also know this exists in Chernobyl, or at least it did before Putin decided to attack Ukraine, right? But people were living in the Chernobyl zone, the babushkas, as they were known, the babushkas of Chernobyl. And they also oftentimes would say, well, we don't want to go to the city because we're used to this environment. We actually are okay in this environment. My привыкли, which is a common refrain. I think this is a story of abandonment in many respects, of how people who, through decades of abandonment, whether it was by, the Tsarist Russian state at first, let's say, to then the Soviet state, right? This was the area of the great Kazakhstani famine, early 1930s, right? Where nearly half of the population of ethnic Kazakhs died during collectivization, both of animals and grain, right? So there was this kind of abandoned by the early Soviet state. Then people were brought in they were central in effect, right, of the Soviet state, the kind of the most technologically advanced area, right? This is where Soviet testing was happening, right? And then to be abandoned again after the fall. And people have kind of had to figure out on their own on how to survive, how to deal with the situation, right? Those are, I mean, let me see if I have a map here. But this is a picture from the house I lived in onto the Polygon. I mean, it's an endless open landscape, isolated, difficult to get to. And people have to maneuver on their own. The fires that I showed you here, this is me carrying a bucket over there, right there. The fires sweep through the test site regularly. This is a natural phenomenon. I mean, sometimes it's somebody throws out a cigarette, but oftentimes it's lightning or people purposefully set fire to pastures so that their neighbors or their enemies don't have access to grasses. So there's a lot of conflicts going on in the region. But I mean, the problems with these kinds of fires is that we don't know if radioactive particles are resuspended in the air or not. And they're not put out with water because, as I mentioned, there is no water in the region. It's limited. So people put them out with sheepskin. So people are hitting the ground, snuffing the flames, which just resuspends potential particles. So the idea was for me at least, I had my mask, but I was just laughed at the whole time.
Scott Sagan, the co-director here. Your reference to Chernobyl makes me recognize that this is not an unfair question to ask you to compare this to other cases. And besides Chernobyl, you have the downwinders in the US, you have Australia, you have the Marshall Islands. Can you tell us how this study differs from the others and what your colleagues who have worked on those cases tell you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm finding is that this is a unique case. At least Chernobyl and Kazakhstan share, at least the babushkas of Chernobyl and the populations in and around the Semipalatinsk Test Site are very different than, let's say, what is happening in Australia, what is happening in Algeria or elsewhere, or where people are seeking compensation, right? The downwind communities, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Marshall Islanders, right? They are different. However, I don't know necessarily if that's the case in all those examples. That is how these communities have been narrated, as victims, as people who have been victimized. And And it seems like this is the typical response, that people narrate themselves, see themselves as victims of nuclear testing. It's not to say that people in Kazakhstan don't, they certainly do. But they're not portraying themselves as victims, as somebody who's seeking compensation. I mean, one of the things that I looked for was, you know, is anybody suing the Kazakh government? Is anybody asking for compensation? They're not. Unlike in Australia, unlike the Marshall Islanders, unlike downwind communities, there's literally not a single court case at all that is asking for some sort of compensation or is asking for the government to move people out. In fact, what is happening right now, and I have some pictures in the book, is that the test site it's like wild east now. I mean, people are coming in there. There's, you know, people are digging up the rest of the metal. There's thousands upon thousands of animals. I have never seen I mean, when I worked there were a lot of herds. Right now, herds are in the thousands of horses, thousands of sheep, all over the site. So in fact, the site right now, as things look, is that, you know, this is going to be an economically developed space. There's a new mine that's going to be operating near ground zero, Naimanjal, near where it's a gold mine. It used to be called Naimanjal, but now it's going to be reopened again. So lots of resources in the region, and people are kind of eager for kind of this kind of economic support.
So, atomic collective. So what elements of this are persisting from the socialist era, or for proto-socialist elements in previous generations long past? In East Berlin, when the Soviet system disappeared, there's been a renewal of the childcare facilities. Mm-hmm. People wanted some of the elements of that era back, and they have brought it back.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, this kind of resembles the social contract from like 1800s, right? Like where you have your fiefdoms or whatever, like go fend for yourselves, kind of a thing. At the same time, you know, what I see the people doing is they're trying to reproduce the savkhoz, the collective farm. Mm. They literally still call their village the savkhoz or the kolkhoz, right? The smaller farms, right? So they're trying to do it, but they're doing it on their own. Some of the people are family members, some of them are connected through kinship, but some of them are not. So they are reproducing it as best as they can. There are certainly huge expectations of, you know, people helping one another. But the thing that's interesting is because these expectations have moved from the state to the household level, you all of a sudden have reconstruction and kind of rethinking of gender roles. So during the Soviet era, all the women and men were, you know, cutting hay, shearing sheep, doing whatever, right? This was this kind of like collective labor. There was not supposed to be a clear gender division, right? Women were supposed to be able to do the same things that men are doing, right? They're komsomol leaders and so on and so forth. After, you know, the state no longer provided, all of this turned to the household level, which means that the roles all of a sudden became more stringent, i.e., very clear division of labor. Women are in the home, men are not, right? So that's not a return necessarily to anything. That again is coming out of necessity because the state is no longer part of, you know, doesn't participate in their lives in that way. Does that answer your question?
Yes, in part, sure.
Yeah. From the back.
Hello, everybody. I'm from Kazakhstan.
Hello.
Biz Kazakhstan'dan kelip o'tirgan g'avurlar, o'rozlardan kimizdir? We for all.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are Kazakhstani scholars from the different field, having an internship in UC Davis, and we are so glad to meet you. Thank you for your effort.
көп алғысымыз шексіз. Мен өзім діни және арал экопроблемаларынан, экологиялық проблемалардан диссертация жазған доктормын. Сондықтан да сіздің айтып отырған сөздеріңіздің біразына құптаймын.
We are so glad that you are raising this very sensitive topic for the Kazakhstani people, and Professor, she's interested in the topic of the Polygon of Semey and as well as Aral's issue.
Осы Америкада біздің ана жақтағы жан айқайымызды, проблемамызды көтеріп жатқаныңызға көптен көп рахмет.
She's saying that thank you for enhancing this topic because this is a big trauma for the Kazakhstans.
Полигон 40 жыл бойы өмір сүрді. 1946 менен 1986 жылға шейін 40 жыл өмір сүрді.
Polygon was going on from in 1948 48 till 86.
Полигонды Невада, Семей проблемасы арқылы, проект арқылы жабылды.
It was closed owing to the project Nevada Semey, which is called.
Semipalatinsk Semey полигоны біздің өзіміздің ішкі жарамыз.
Yeah, this is a big trauma for us, for Kazakhstan. Citizens. Yeah, we have a little gift for you from the.
Oh,
I also would like to add a little bit at my mother, Saule Dozjan, if you ever heard her. She wrote a novel about the Polygon. If you are interested, we also collaborate. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We still, yes, Jim.
Yeah, can go there.
Follow up on that.
I'm just, I have a question. And I'm going to ask it. I cannot follow up on that. First of all, welcome to all of you.
Grandfather.
So you showed that photo of the man holding the child.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious for younger people, like what would, like, do you expect when that child grows up that that child is going to stay there, or
This one will,
yeah?
but that's because of the rules of inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
So the oldest son almost always moves away. First of all, there's limited amount of housing in Koian. There's not enough housing. So, but in general, oldest children move away, especially oldest son. But the youngest son will always stay and take care of the farm. That's the youngest son. His name is Saltanat.
I have a question from Sig Hecker, which says,
Sig.
the man, well, to thank you for the marvelous talk, but also to ask what conveniences, modern conveniences, the Koianers have. And he sees a cell phone in this man's trouser pocket.
Yes.
So
the cell phone is, okay, so what modern, okay, there is a satellite dish, so there's definitely TV. There is no running water. Not that there wasn't running water, there was during the Soviet era, but there's a well now, right? People have television. There was one landline. There was no Wi-Fi or cell phone until, guess what? Starlink. So now with Starlink, people who can afford can have access to the internet and a phone, which is actually quite nice because at this point, it simply means that it's much easier to then get in touch with people. Otherwise, it was virtually impossible. So if you're stuck out there in the steppe, you don't have, you're stuck in the steppe unless someone finds you. And they may or may not. Thank you, Sig.
Yes, one. I have two questions.
Just a quick question.
For one.
Since we were talking about the biological versus social kind of inheritances of radioactivity, I was wondering if people in Koian are in touch with their family members that did move away. So I was fascinated by when you said that radioactive contamination is just a part of the landscape that Koianers navigate, and it's not an abstract threat. So is it that people that move away still have the same genetic predispositions to all of the things that we've been talking about? So is the calculus more that even if I physically escaped, I'm going to be subject to the same fate? Or is it the sort of social, despite increased radioactivity, there is more to be had here in the manner in which you were describing?
I mean, in a certain sense, people leave because like I said, there's limited amount of housing. So people do have to leave indeed. Are you asking if they're predisposed to the same things? I mean, certainly if people are exposed, especially children are the most in danger of being affected.
So do you find a sort of comparison with the family members that moved away among the people that you spoke to?
Yes, they do. I mean, people say like a lot of people end up dying in the cities. And in many respects, it's true. And it's not necessarily because of radiation. Some of it is suicide. Some of it is drug overdoses, alcoholism, poverty. But one of the things that's super interesting, again, about the cases in Kazakhstan is that generally we also have this narrative, right, that people go to the cities so that they provide for the families back home, right? Most literature, social science literature actually says this, that, when we think about migrants, they go and work on farms or they go and work in the cities to bring that money to the village. In Kazakhstan, it's literally the opposite. If people go to the city, the families from the village support the families in the city. Yes, the kids make money, not a lot of money, but all the food, the butter, the milk, the sheep, all the meat, it's going to the city. And in fact, for a lot of people who end up buying apartments in the city, all of it is money from the herds that are sold and then, sold and converted to money so that you can buy something. So again, an interesting situation where the flow of goods is the other way.
We have time for one more question. I think, Lynn, you had a question.
Hi, Magda. You mentioned that there's no question that there are more birth defects. I wonder what you know about that. Did you talk to doctors? Do people volunteer it? Do you know the effects on families? What do you know about that?
I mean, people don't want to volunteer it because that's could potentially be a stigma. But I have spoken to doctors who are working in Semipalatinsk, epidemiologists who are saying, yes, we do see more congenital anomalies in the population. And there are different kinds of anomalies, like, one of the things like being born with an extra finger, let's say, or something like that. But generally, that's what the doctors are saying. I don't think there is conclusive research that counts this. I don't think there is a conclusive finding about congenital anomalies. They're there. People talk about them, but I don't have the literature that backs them up.
Okay, Magda, thank you very much for a wonderful seminar. You won't need any further recommendations, I think, to read the book. But,
yes.
But when I read it, I thought it was a gem. That was the word that came to my mind. It's a wonderful study, and a study where I think the fact that you spend so much time with the people, you don't see them just as victims, and the humanity is brought out in very effective way in the book. So, Magda, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.